Can you all think of, before we start looking at more of the British taxation attempts, is there within 10 or 20 miles of your town any Oklahoma historical markers that you can think of off the top of your head? Civil War, battle, or anything around Muldrow that you guys can think of?
Have like Sequoia's home and stuff like that, but we don't have any battles, I don't think.
Okay, Sequoia's home. Arcoma?
Backbone Mountain.
Awesome, yeah. And Spiro? Spiral Mounds?
Yeah, the Spiral Mounds.
That was a softball. So here's going to be another opportunity for class bonus. And let me see, I give you a week to do this. Let me give you 2 weeks because I know you guys are seniors and you've got all those ordering graduation announcements and maybe pictures and proms, and so I'll give you 2 weeks. So Thursday, March 7th as a class, and how you work it out, but gonna just go on the honor system that everybody will contribute, but we'll give you a 3 to 4 minute slot on Thursday, March 7th to share about the historical event, like what happened at Backbone Mountain, or the person, or the site, like the Spiral Mounds. Just give her a little report on that. I know you can look all these things up online, but if you can maybe have a picture of the site or consult some written sources, that would be great too. I will post that on the course homepage today just as a reminder, and there'll be a little bit more detailed instructions. So we'll do that for 15 bonus points. We're going to pick up with the various acts or pieces of legislation that Britain continued to try to enforce on the colonies. And let's just test your memory. Since Tuesday, these attempts at getting the colonists to pay taxes and finance the war, and also for Britain to keep a tight control on the colonies so they'll still get their natural resources and have a captive audience to buy British goods. This all kind of goes back into the short statement that I said my history teacher shared. Does anybody remember what that was? My high school history teacher.
Wasn't it like money makes the world go round?
Yes, money makes the world go round. Politically speaking, of course. And so Britain has defeated France. They've expanded their territory in the New World. not also forgetting that they were fighting on other continents with France. And so it's all about broadening their kingdom, or their don't want to call it a kingdom, but their country and their territories. And then also being a country that has adopted mercantilism, you'll recall the goal is for them to become completely self-sustaining, where they're not dependent upon other countries. And so it is about the money. The Sugar Act was repealed. We talked a little bit about the Quartering Act, which will not be on the test except maybe a possible bonus. And we also talked about the other small tax in 1764 of the Currency Act. So let's move on to probably the most significant piece of legislation that Britain tried to enforce, the Stamp Act of 1765. Do you recall who the Prime Minister of England was, having been appointed in 1763 by King George?
George Grenville.
George Grenville. So we have George squared in England trying to control the colonies. So George Grenville, being a financial expert, has experienced some setbacks, so to speak, or some defeats with the Sugar Act, and these other two acts being resisted by the colonists who were angered. So he comes up with a new plan called the Stamp Act of 1765. And basically, all paper goods in the colonies had to be marked with a special stamp that was basically originated from England. And this was on, you can see on this slide, newspapers, wills, licenses, but it included all legal documents, even almanacs, like Ben Franklin's Old Farmer's Almanac, playing cards had to have this stamp on it. Virtually every piece of paper, printed piece of paper in the colonies had to have this stamp, which if you bought one of these items with paper, that stamp indicated that a part of the funds were a tax that went to England. So the merchants in America who produced newspapers, playing cards, those who produced any kind of piece of paper had to pay some tax to England. Now, this is why this is so very important as we look at these factors, these rifts that are leading up to revolution. The Stamp Act, you recall the Sugar Act really only affected financially the merchants and tradesmen. Other colonists did protest, and they didn't, but they weren't real severe protests, and it wasn't widespread across all the colonists in all the colonies. The Stamp Act taxed everybody. And so protests were widespread, and the colonists began to fear where this would lead concerning their freedoms. They were starting to see an erosion in more of their freedoms. So, more colonists are protesting, and they eventually form a Stamp Act Congress. Let us watch a small video, short video on the Stamp Act Congress.
In the decades leading up to the American Revolutionary War, the British tightened their grip on the American colonies by passing laws and taxes the colonists hated. One of the most hated taxes was the Stamp Act, passed on March 22nd, 1765. The Stamp Act taxed all paper used for legal or commercial purposes. In response to the Stamp Act, many of the American colonies decided to meet and discuss what should be done about the growing tyranny of the British. In October 1765, 27 delegates from 9 of the American colonies met in New York City as part of the Stamp Act Congress. The Stamp Act Congress, which was in fact the first significant gathering of the American colonies, passed resolutions to beckon the King of England to treat the colonies fairly. Let's back up to examine the events that led to the Stamp Act Congress in more detail. As already mentioned, the Stamp Act of 1765 taxed paper used for everything from calendars to court documents and even playing cards. The tax itself was not that expensive, but the American colonists still became angry for several reasons.
All right, let's stop there for a moment and let's discuss that phrase you just saw, which was so very critical to the revolution: taxation without representation. As colonists began to fear more and more of the British, or imagining that the British were going to continue to erode their freedoms, and someone, if you have your textbook, someone have your textbook with you?
Yes.
Would you open it up to page 127, please? I want to see if the page numbers are, if it lines up with my text. I have the American 1 and 2 history. Does it have the Whig point of view on the page 127?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So all of you need to be aware of the four principles that were really starting to crystallize in Americans' minds. It's at the bottom of page 127. They were starting to worry about the principle of self-government. Jay, does it have at the bottom in the margin a little note about the Stamp Act?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so those four things should be pretty much directly across from that, self-government, equality of economic opportunity, religious freedom, and then territorial expansion. Be familiar with those 4 American principles that were really starting to solidify. And so you can see why the colonists are starting to fear more and more erosion of these things from the British. So Virginia, their House of Burgesses acts first, and they pass what is called the Virginia Resolves. I have a clip of that for you. The Virginia Resolves, this was Virginia's resistance to the Stamp Act. Patrick Henry was one of the prime members of the Virginia House of Burgesses, a lawyer who was instrumental in helping these resolves be written down. But he was the one who penned the phrase, "No taxation without representation." And here are the first 5 resolves, and this will be posted today on the class homepage. All men of Britain in the colony, that is in Virginia, whether they are settled or they're still, wandering, should be treated as such as they would treat any person of Britain. Second resolve was that all the people in the colony should be treated as if they were born within England's realm. Those that are born in England have representatives in Parliament, and so they have someone on their behalf when it comes to taxation. And so the Virginia Resolves were, pointing out that no one from Virginia was in the Parliament. The third resolve, no unbearable tax should be imposed on anybody. And then the fourth resolve, Virginians shouldn't be imposed with a tax that was not passed by a body that had not gained their consent. Remember, self-government. Those that govern get their consent from the governed. The people of Virginia had not given Parliament consent to pass the Stamp Act. And then the fifth resolve, there were 7 of them, but the fifth one we want to look at is that only the Virginia General Assembly has the right to lay taxes on people in Virginia. So Virginia led the way, and then 8 more colonies adopted similar resolves, so 9 of the 13 colonies. And then that leads us to the Stamp Congress, so I'm going to jump back to that.
First of all, the tax needed to be paid with British currency instead of colonial dollars, which made it difficult for the colonists to pay. Second of all, those who violated the Stamp Act could be tried without a jury. Perhaps most importantly, the colonists were very upset that the British Parliament passed.
Oh, man. My bad. I should have read about that site. Okay, so 27 delegates from 9 colonies meet at the Stamp Act Congress, and it is basically a meeting to come together and come up with a plan on how they are going to protest and resist this tax. Here's a very key point that is important for understanding the revolution coming about. You finally have the colonists uniting together to oppose a British piece of legislation. Instead of having various or numerous individual colonists in the colonies, maybe speaking out against, like, for example, the Sugar Act, and it was primarily the merchants and tradesmen who were hit hard by that, because this was a tax that everybody felt, and they saw British encroachment starting to erode their cherished beliefs, their cherished principles. This was kind of the turning point that started to unite the colonists together. So be familiar with the issue of no taxation without representation. Again, know those 4 principles on page 127 at the bottom. And then understand the significance of the Stamp Act being a catalyst for a widespread uniting of colonists. Any questions on that? All right. In Massachusetts, you had a fairly significant resistance to the Stamp Act. Virginia was the first to have a, what we would say, a government reaction with the Virginia Resolves. Massachusetts, we can say, really presented the most significant resistance by the common people. All right. You had a group of 9 You had a group of 9. Let me get it here. Here we go. All right, you should be able to see that. A group of 9 shopkeepers and artisans who called themselves the Loyal 9 began to prepare a resistance to the Stamp Act. And this group grew and was known as the Sons of Liberty. And soon you had a group of the Sons of Liberty in every colony. And again, these are primarily the common people. And again, this is a demonstration, this is a very vivid demonstration of the breakdown of the deference that we looked at in Module 1 from British society, where you defer to your betters. this is a very, very strong illustration of common people understanding that in the new colonies, they have more rights, they have more influence. And so this group is formed, and it's a very, very influential group. They lead a mob, and when I say mob, I'm talking about a large group that's ready to protest, and not in the sense that they want to kill people, but they do some demonstrations. You can see here in this paragraph, they burn an effigy of Andrew Oliver, who was one of the collectors of the Stamp Act tax, burn an effigy of him. And later they also do the same with the governor, Thomas Hutchison, or he's the lieutenant governor. And so they're rioting, but they're burning effigies of these people who are loyal to Britain in imposing the taxes, the stamp tax. Here's a key point about the Sons of Liberty. And you also had other groups mentioned in the textbook, like the Daughters of Liberty. These were women colonists who refused to buy British products, especially clothing, and started to make their own clothing. But what you're seeing here is the Stamp Act is politicizing ordinary common people. This self-government, this principle of self-government is growing as this group is protesting this legislation. And the burning of these effigies demonstrated that these were not just random riots that were just an angry reaction. There was anger, but they were organized. These were political demonstrations. And so the Sons of Liberty and these demonstrations set a precedent for future American history of common people being involved in their political, in politics, being involved in political legislation. Just this past week, we saw, if you watched the news here in Oklahoma, a group of Oklahomans wanted a state bill passed that would completely abolish all abortions. And that bill failed in the state Senate, but you have ordinary citizens standing on this principle that is basically introduced here of common people organizing together and making political stands. And, you know, while it might be called a riot in our textbook or by historians, it certainly wasn't a riot compared to some of the riots we've seen today in today's modern world. All right, so you need to be aware of that the Stamp Act is a catalyst for common citizens to start organizing and having political protests and demonstrations. We certainly know, not just in our state, but even in the capital, when there was 3 groups, in Washington, D.C. on January 12th, with the students from the Catholic high school in Indiana, and then the group of the Black Israelites, and then the Native Americans, all meeting to protest or demonstrate that this is a cherished American ideal today that has its initial planting from the Stamp Act. Any questions? There will be, not probably, there will be on the test a short essay question about the significance of the Stamp Act. Why, what it is, how it affected the colonists, why it is significant in American political history. So 11 days after they burned Oliver's effigy, I mentioned that they burned the effigy of Thomas Hutchinson, who was the lieutenant governor. And the group of people gathered around his house as they burned his effigy, and they were shouting liberty and property, liberty and property. And this was a group that wanted to get violent. They wanted to burn down some houses. But the first house owner, this is just kind of a little bit of humorous history. The first house owner gives them rum punch to drink, and they gladly receive that and decide not to burn down the house. But they did destroy Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson's house. So just a little bit of piece of Jeopardy history that you might need on your appearance on Jeopardy. Soon, other colonies begin to riot. They follow Massachusetts' lead. And so the Stamp Act is really a tinderbox that ignites this fire in the colonies. The colonists did not like to be taxed, as we said, without having representatives in government. And so, excuse me a second. Come on in, you're okay. How did the British view this? How did the British respond to the colonists not wanting to be taxed without representation? Well, Parliament said this. This was their view. Remember, they suffered from not really understanding the mindset of the colonists. But Parliament basically told the colonists, you have virtual representation in Parliament. All of Parliament, even though we're over here in Britain, we are your representatives. And so we will do what we feel is best for you, the colonists living 3,000 miles across the pond. And so we are your virtual reps. So the issue was actual representation versus virtual representation. The virtual representation would be those in Parliament that you'll recall were more of the upper class, House of Lords, House of Commons, and the actual representation would include citizens elected by the colonists. And those citizen electors who would come from the colonies and be elected by their peers, there would be more of a harmony of interest. Whereas the House of Lords and House of Commons, all the way in England, do not have the same outlook and interests as those in Massachusetts and Virginia. So England is outraged with these riots, okay? How dare our colonists, our British subjects do this, right? We defeated the French. We've left our army over there to, in their minds, protect the colonists. In the American minds, remember, a standing army is a sign of tyranny. And so, but then you had, along with the protests, the American colonists, you know, like the Daughters of Liberty, they were not purchasing British goods. And other colonists started to protest by not purchasing British goods. And so Parliament has another group raise their voice, and that is the British merchants are saying, hey, wait a second. Hold up on your taxing of the colonists. We're losing business. Again, money is making the world go around here. And so the American colonists are not consuming enough of our items. We need you to kind of back off with all the taxation. All right, let's take a break here for 5 minutes, and we will pick back up there and move to a couple more of the acts that were passed. So 5 minutes will be 10:20. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're on break. Okay. So Parliament has a dilemma with the colonists rioting and also making a statement by withholding or refusing to purchase British or European goods. So a financial hit, which is causing the British merchants to lose business. So Parliament has this to deal with. And in March 1766, they repeal the Stamp Act. But in doing so, they wanted some reassurances from the colonists. So the colonies send Benjamin Franklin to Britain to basically try to help the British understand the American mind. Franklin is a wise man, and he gives answers to Britain that they would want to hear, but he also is honest with them and tells them what they do not want to hear. England does not want to hear that colonists do not appreciate being taxed by Parliament, by not having representatives in the government to fight for their interests. So they repealed the Stamp Act, but also in the same year, you can see same day, they passed the Declaratory Act of 1766. And this basically was a declaration that Parliament had the right to tax the British colonies and make decisions for them concerning all things. So just think about how the colonists responded to that. We repeal the Stamp Act, but then we can pass any future acts that would tax you, and we would make other decisions that basically we are operating unilaterally for you, even though we're way over here in England. Needless to say, the colonists would not have liked that, and they didn't. In 1767, you have a head of the Treasury of England named Charles Townshend. Townshend is a hardliner, and he is determined that he is going to get these Americans in line, get them to submit to English authority and pay their taxes. And so, named after him, there were 4 acts called the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts of 1767. And the 4 things included, first of all, the Suspending Act. Suspending Act. And what this basically did was it stopped the New York Assembly, the New York government, from conducting any further business until they started meeting the financial requirements of the Quartering Act. If you recall, the Quartering Act of 1765, colonists were required to house and take care of British troops. So New York was especially negligent of this act, and so the first act of the Townshend Acts was to get them to comply. The second act is probably the one that we hear most about. The second one is called the Revenue Act. And this places taxes on basically paint, glass, lead, paper, and tea. All these manufactured goods. So another tax. The colonists, you know, their anger is starting to boil over again. And these taxes, you need to keep this in mind as we probably will get to the Boston Tea Party on Tuesday, but these taxes were payable at the colonial ports port cities, because these taxes were on items coming from England. So they've already paid for them. Now they're going to pay taxes on them as they come into the port cities. The third act that was enacted basically created an American Board of Customs office. A customs office in America, which included more officers, searchers of ships, spies, Coast Guard vessels, search warrants, writs of assistance, and a board of customs commissioners that were at Boston. One such incident was John Hancock. His ship, which was called the Liberty, was seized by the British around 1770, and this was not received well by the colonists. You had some what we would call firebrands, these fiery colonists. One such man was named James Otis. Others would include Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry. But James Otis really worked hard to try to get the British to come to their senses. And this seizing of ships and being able to board them and search them really pushed these firebrands to start speaking up and working to try to get the British to ease up. And needless to say, it caused altercations and riots in bars and things like that. One thing that was especially egregious about this third act was the writs of assistance basically were a blanket search warrant. That did not go well with the colonists. An invasion of privacy, as these British officials had authority to go into homes. And then the fourth act, which will be important for the discussion on the Boston Tea Party, was known as the Indemnity Act. And this was basically to help the East India Tea Company to compete with the tea trade that was being smuggled in by the Dutch. So that'll be discussed more in depth as we get to the Boston Tea Party. So the Townshend Acts once again stirred up the ire of the colonists. And in response to that, the British sent 4,000 more troops into Boston. This did not especially sit well with the people of Boston. Again, a standing army is, in their minds, a view of tyranny. The colonies were to be controlled by the civilians, not by the military. So these 4,000 troops are living in Boston. Fist fights would occasionally break out between soldiers and citizens. Soldiers would also need to work, and so they would be hired and they would get paid 20% less. And so that was putting some of the colonists out of jobs. This was not good. So what happened in 1770? And that was, I failed to mention this, but under the Townshend Acts, and especially that third one, colonial assemblies were suspended. And you had British appointed authorities ruling. So that was not looked upon favorably, of course. And so in 1770, you had the Boston Massacre, which took place on March 5th. 5 colonists were killed and 6 wounded. And hopefully you guys have been discussing that on the discussion and have really tried to understand, was it, as what we would call today, fake news, or was it really a massacre? This is the painting that Paul Revere produced that was put in the newspapers. And the depiction really looks like the British are firing on the gathering crowds, but things were very tense. John Adams was a lawyer who defended the British soldiers who were found innocent. And this, of course, angered the colonists. And so it led them to form committees of correspondence. Committees of correspondence that would help colonists stay informed. And, you can see a parallel between the committees of correspondence and today's social media, where so many people today do not have to depend upon the mainstream media for their information. Social media, everybody has pretty much instant access to the news or to events. And so that's what we kind of see a principle here with these committees of correspondence. And it helps to keep the colonists united. Keeping the colonists in harmony against what they are perceiving as British hostility, British tyranny over the colonies. Any questions on the Townshend Acts? As the colonists continued to unite, you also had a group, the colonists that united were referred to as patriots. You also had a smaller group called loyalists. And these were those colonists who stayed loyal to the monarchy in Britain, the Parliament. And it was about 80% patriots and 20% loyalists. So not all colonists were on board. And in common life in the colonies, you might have a pastor who was a fiery patriot who would preach on the need to rebel against tyranny, to join the cause and fight for your freedoms. And then you would have maybe a pastor at another church who was a loyalist. You know, we as citizens in this world are not to rebel against the governing authorities. So you had these kind of lines being marked in the colonies. You had a third group that fall under the category of patriots, but they were more moderate. They were not as hardcore as most of your patriots, but they tended to lean toward wanting to have basically the freedoms that we talked about, those four freedoms, those four principles, those core principles that were being strongly developed in the American colonies. So keep those groups in mind as we continue to go through the tensions that that continue to grow and be fueled by the British actions to tax and try to control, and then American reactions. We will pick up with a little bit more information on the Boston Massacre on Tuesday. Any questions on anything that we discussed today?
Yes, can you summarize the 5 resolves, the Virginia resolves?
Yeah. Let me get that up again for you. And I'm going to post this on the homepage too. But basically, all men of a British colony, whether they are already settled or if they're still, you know, and this is that principle of territorial expansion. You know, the colonists are living here. They should have that right to expand. So any men that did not have, were not settled with a homestead, but they still should be treated as anyone in Britain would be treated, with the same rights. And remember, it was men only who could own property. So the second one is a little different, that everybody in the colony, men and women, should be treated as if they were born within England's realm. Now, remember, there is slavery in the colonies. It's not as prominent in the North, but there were slaves. This would not apply to them. So it's Englishmen. So any colonist that was born in the colonies should be treated as if they were born in England. The third resolve deals with taxes. There should be no unbearable tax imposed on anybody. Also, they should not have to pay a tax that was passed by the Parliament without the colonists having consented to it. Of course, they're not going to consent to what Parliament does because Parliament is not in the colonies. It's there's no representation. And then the fifth resolve is that only the leaders in Virginia have the right to tax Virginians. And again, 8 other colonies adopted similar resolves to protect those 4 principles on page 127. Any other questions?
No, sir.
All right, so I will put these notes up that we went through today, and then the bonus assignment will be posted, and you'll have 2 weeks to do that. So the quiz is available. It's due on Saturday night by midnight or 11:59. So it's on chapters 4 and 5, open book. If there's no other questions, have a great weekend. We'll see you Tuesday.